Hey everyone, Jay DeSherry here again. If these walls could talk, let's decode footwear science. Over the course of my career, I've been pretty lucky. I've had the ability to do a lot of footwear validation, innovation, and even design work over my career. And what I want to do today is really kind of go into a critical thinking deep dive on what the parts of your shoe actually do. I want you to understand not just is this shoe better than that shoe, but understand how cushioning, geometry, posting, uppers, rockers, super shoes, how all this stuff actually works to change gait. Because shoes are passive, right? It's how they interact with the runner that really matters. So let's have some fun. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, we had shoe wars. It's a period of civil war. The traditionalists and the barefoot runners have gone to battle. New members of the Hoka tribe have overtaken rebel bases across the galaxy, while super shoes look to take on the galaxy. This healthcare community is in shambles as the Empire has successfully created the Death Star of misinformation called Internet Shoe Blogs and Reviews that confuse patients, athletes, and clinicians. They place their trust in Chris and Jay to lead them through this drunk, dark, and mysterious search to restore crazy runners across the galaxy. Okay, obviously a little joke here, but here's the deal. The dark side taught us that the force will stop you from moving. We were taught back in my PT career, right, when I was in school, that we have certain type of shoes, right, and that we've got certain types of shoes, cushion shoes, stability shoes, and motion control shoes. And if you had a high arch, normal arch, and flat foot, or if you were a supinator, a neutral person, or a pronator, we could classify you in to match you with the correct shoe and prevent your injuries. The problem is that running injury prevalence and incidence has not gone down at all since the bane of these classifications. And the reality is that's not how the force works, right? The force doesn't stop your foot from moving. We need to get past this idea behind stopping pronation and controlling the foot. And I hope to make a case for that over the course of this talk. Again, previous aims have not worked, right? If our goal, okay, with footwear is to help people decrease the stress per stride, let's break down what that is, right? So the first thing we can talk about is controlling pronation, right? Does this idea behind net motion really make a difference? And I would say the answer is profoundly no. We have not seen any idea that controlling pronation makes a difference. The next idea here is impact reduction, right? So can we minimize the impact per stride? I would say minimizing the impact per stride should not be the holy grail we're chasing, which I hope to reshape your thought about cushioning and talk about impact attenuation as opposed to just impact reduction, right? And again, put this out there, point blank, for those of you who want to argue, there's been no decrease in injury rates in the past 40 years. So all the fancy stuff on your walls isn't making a difference in terms of how our athletes perform. So research does not support the idea that controlling the foot is the answer, nor does it work. There's very few studies where you actually get to go and put bone pins on the actual bones. So you're literally cutting the skin, drilling down and putting markers in the actual bones of the foot and looking at mobility. This is one study that we have to do this. Obviously, IRBs don't like to approve studies like this. They're very invasive, but they put intracortical bone markers on these grad students and have them run 3 different types of shoes. And they didn't see a change in joint mobility greater than 1 degree, right? And that's actually getting, again, 0 error bone movement, right? So different shoe types did not change the motion in the foot. Now, they had more motion variability between subjects, okay, than they did with different footwear characteristics, and just drives the point home that different people have different feet, and feet move differently, and that's fine, okay? Another study. Let's not get too bogged down with foot types. Feet move more similar than different. This is a study that we published back in JOSPT in 2009, which really reshaped the way I thought about footwear. We used traditional criteria to look at navicular drop, right? So we had runners come in. This is 25 individuals per group, by the way. We had people looking at a navicular drop test, right? So just basically sitting, To standing, how much do you see a navicular actually drop? We use this classic root test. It was been developed back in the 80s, and was able to statistically identify 3 different foot mobility types. We had a hypermobile that dropped 7 to 10, a neutral which dropped 4 to 6 millimeters, and a hypo group that dropped 0 to 3 millimeters. So we were able to get 3 statistically significantly different groups, and that's great using the navicular drop test. But let's look at things when people actually walk and run. So we made a foot model which actually looked at the amount of rear foot motion, forefoot motion, and also used the navicular as a floating point above the forefoot plane and rear foot plane to look at how much a foot moves dynamically, right? It's a dynamic navicular drop test during walking and running. And what we found was that people with a neutral amount of drop, right, your typical neutral foot type, had a drop of 8.3 millimeters when they walked and 8.6 when they ran. That's our baseline, right? Then we looked at hypomobile feet, and when hypomobile feet walked or ran, they dropped an average of 7.9 millimeters walking and 8.2 millimeters running, and that was not statistically different at all between neutral and hypomobile feet. So when you look at walking and running, they move more similarly than different. Look at hypermobile feet, we had a tiny bit of difference, right? So we had a drop of dynamic navicular drop of 8.7 millimeters walking and 9.9 millimeters of running. For those of you at home, if you want to take your fingers and put them about 1.2 to 1.7 millimeters apart there, and you can see there's not a whole lot of difference, okay? And that's about the difference that we're seeing in terms of dynamic navicular drop. So feet move more similarly than different in walking and running, and the reason why is a difference in this type of test than as compared to a sit-to-stand test we typically do on navicular drop assessments is realize that when you're going from sitting to standing, you don't have a huge change. This test is done bilateral, right? So you have 100% of body weight split between 2 feet. When you look at walking and running, you have about 110% body weight applied every single stride. And we look at running, you have about 2.5 times body weight applied every single stride. And again, so we've got shorter ground contact times, and also the whole foot isn't in contact the entire gait cycle, right? So you've got rear foot contact going to flat foot, going to toe off, right? So we're able to look at how much a foot torsion, not just at mid stance, but also as its heel comes off. And this is important to look at because timing actually is really critical too, right? So on the top, you'll see a classic butterfly pattern of our walking ground reaction force. Okay, so we have a peak during loading, and then we have double support. We have a peak during push off again. And what we saw was that the peak foot mobility occurred during push off phase, right? And that's no surprise. And because forces are high, and again, we've got less of the foot on the ground. And when you look at running, right, we've got our single peak here, right? This is our impact peak, and this is our active peak. And what you'll notice is that we had the most amount of foot deformation, right? I don't like to do is pronation, because pronation is fine. It's just a normal motion. But we had the most amount of navicular drop after the heel came up off the ground. That's really important, right? A lot of the research that's been done on foot mobility is all done in mid stance when the foot's on the ground. In this study, we were able to actually look at what happens once the heel comes off, right? So typically, we've been told for years that, we have these posts and shoes to, quote, stop the rear foot from moving. Well, I would argue at the point in time which you theoretically need the most help with your foot mechanics, the post on the inside of the rear foot isn't even touching the ground to do anything, right? So, it's important to understand how much the foot moves and when it moves. And to go back to this other slide again, on the left side of your slide, you'll see we've got some differences in forefoot and rear foot torsion. And what we found was, if you look at hypomobile feet, the rear foot and forefoot actually tended to stay pretty much in plane. When you looked at neutral feet, we tend to be a little bit more obliquity of the forefoot in relation to the rear foot just before contact. And then we look at the hypermobile people, we saw that they tended to have even more obliquity between the forefoot and rear foot, again, even prior to contact. So our body somehow has some kind of strategies we use to orient our feet, our forefoot and rear foot, in the right position to use our structure. And we'll talk about why this is really important when we talk about a foot moving with the body in just a little bit later. So again, feet move pretty similar, and don't get too in the weeds on classifying the foot type, okay, in terms of amount of navicular drop. So when we look at this idea behind cushioning, right? So let's talk about facts here, right? So here is the vertical ground reaction force. So again, this is contact, right? So right at contact, we've got about 0.1 times body weight on the ground, right? Then we basically move up the chain here, right? And then we've got this impact peak. This impact peak is approximate, let's say 2.1 or 2.2 times body weight. And we basically had, this is your leg colliding with the ground, okay, this first peak. Then we've got this other peak here called your active peak, right? We're roughly 2.5 times body weight. So if you're going to talk about cushioning, okay, here's where the leg contacts the ground, right? You barely have any load on your body. It's just your leg spring mass. Basically, you can imagine taking your foot and throwing it in front of you. Do you want to land hard or soft? Doesn't really matter. Not a whole lot of load there. The amount of load that we have to deal with is actually a lot during mid-stance. So my point is, it's not so much what happens right here, it's what's happening up at this peak value. That's why I say cushioning isn't something to look at in terms of impact reduction. It's something to be looked at in terms of how it filters these forces and how we attenuate the loads from contact up into mid-stance. So continuing our journey here, right? The way we classify feet is not really effective. There's a great study by Ryan and Van Gent said, despite their wide use, current conventions for assigning stability categories are simplistic and not successful in preventing injury in runners. Another study here, the parts of a shoe don't help, right? So although the footwear industry has made significant advancements in quality and construction of new materials and methods, there are yet to be a corresponding decrease in injury rates in runners. Again, it's not keeping people healthy. When you read research, they don't like people to make strongly worded claims at the end of the study, right? They basically say, yes, okay, we found this in our study and we should look at this and it warrants new direction. This study didn't say that. Richards in 2009 said the use of traditional shoes to affect running injury rates, enjoyment, performance, and OA risk, physical activity levels, and overall athlete health and well-being remains unknown and may in fact have potential to cause harm. The prescription of shoe categories to runners is not evidence-based. So what I want to do is get us away from this idea of looking at things in terms of like motion control, stability, cushion, and start looking critically at the parts, right? Because you can get easily caught up in the weeds, right? We can basically get told that, oh, the barefoot runners are the answer, right? And that you have to abandon all shoes and, be this Jedi warrior and look for the light and the truth and barefoot running. Again, young clinicians, you know not what you do. You must unlearn what you've learned, okay? We are going to take a deep dive into what shoes actually do, okay? I've been able to do a lot, as I mentioned before, with different companies to look at how we can innovate, validate, and progress and advance what we can do from a footwear perspective. This is a constantly ongoing process. And I would say that if you correctly designed and more importantly, match the shoe to your runner, right, you should be able to see a quantified decrease in body stress and quantified improvements in running economy. And we can do this. We can test this, and we're going to go through all the parts of the shoe today and talk about what actually happens to make these things work or can actually lead these things to fail. So I always say, again, people first, shoes second, okay? We look at reality, right? Runners line up on the line, okay? Shoes don't line up on the line, right? We have to look at how runners interact with their footwear, and we get a certain result. And shoes, by definition, act as a filter, right? They are the link between our bodies and the ground, and they filter how we sense, control, and stabilize, right? Shoes aren't stable. We talk about there's a stable shoe, there's a mobile shoe, or a cushion shoe. They're just shoes, right? It's how that shoe interacts with you from a biomechanical standpoint and from a proprioceptive standpoint, which changes our behavior during the running process. So, let's stop chasing foot motion, right? We kind of gave some reasons why we don't want to just chase degrees and numbers and individual drop and start looking at whole body strategies. I mentioned earlier, our goal is to help people decrease the stress per stride. So let's take this and decrease stress per stride into aspects, right? First aspect is going to talk about body stability. Mostly we're talking about here is transverse plane issues or movement path issues, right? And the reason why we talk about transverse plane is the foot doesn't move just in sagittal plane and frontal plane and rotational motion, right? It basically we have that axis of pronation is diagonal within the foot, right? And so we've got all three planes, but it's really this rotational path of center of pressure to the foot and the vectors that chase the foot, which really affect how things get stressed, right? So we're talking about rotational control starting from the ground up. We're also going to talk about comfort and compliance. And again, not just talking about, impact, right? But talking about how we attenuate that and how the body stiffens during the stride, right? Because if we can do this, we can see how shoes become a filter to achieve our goal to help people decrease their stress per stride, because that is going to give us a better result. So it's important to understand that people say, okay, what's important, stability or comfort, compliance? It depends what you're looking at, depends what your patient's got going on, right? So again, the goal of this is not to say that you should go buy shoe X or shoe Y. The goal is to say, hey, here are some things I might want to look for if my patient's presenting with these type of symptoms, right? So let's break our critical shoe parts down. Let's talk about shoe parts in terms of width. We're going to talk about shoes in terms of cushioning, if it's the marshmallows. We'll talk about heel to toe drop, and we'll also talk about posting. Okay, so let's talk about comfort, right? Here's one of the feet of one of my kids many, many years ago. And you can notice that the widest part of a newborn's foot is not the met heads, right? It's actually the toes, right? And so we talk about this idea behind shoes, and shoes have become something of fashion, right? And people like tapered toe boxes because it looks nice. The reality is that if we have a shoe that fits the body better, right, we tend to see better movement. So when we talk about comfort, right, Ben Onega's come out saying a comfortable shoe is what you're chasing. A comfortable shoe is a foot that actually fits your foot shape, okay? And so when we talk about construction anatomy, we want to make sure we're allowing for shoes to fit feet and not feet to fit in shoes. I should mention here, this is what I practice, what I preach. I've got two kids myself, and they are both in pretty wide toe box shoes because I want to give them the gift of, again, better foot health long term. It's a great radiograph image which kind of broke the internet years ago, basically having someone stand right barefoot, and you can see the foot naturally does what? It splays out, because that's what feet do when you load them. Okay, they're mobile structures. And then when you look at what happens in terms of shoes, you can see how that shoe is actually constricting that natural splay, right? So I don't want to think about just width. People always talk about a wide shoe versus allowing your forefoot to splay. We're not talking about a wide shoe. We're talking about a forefoot a volume that allows your foot to actually splay out. So one of my colleagues, Ray McClanahan, came out and said, hey, look, let's actually look at just an insole test, right? If you take your foot and put your foot on top of the insole, take the insole out, right? Does the shape of the insole actually match the shape of your foot, right? If it does, you're on the right path. If your foot is being constrained or overhanging that insole in some capacity, right, you're going to have a compression or restriction of the way your foot functions. Doesn't take a genius to understand a pyramid is a lot more stable than a skyscraper. Why? Because the base is wide, okay? And we know that feet naturally want to splay out during the stance phase, right? And if you have volume there for your feet to splay out, wider is more stable. Your foot can do a really good job. All that multi-link articulating structure can do a good job at stabilizing your body. If you constrain it, you can't achieve as much stability through you. Again, not through you, but the shoe, but through you. This is a really interesting study we did years ago. I had a company come to me and say that, they wanted to look at what happens when we put things inside the shoe, right? Because we've been told for years that, heel counters are supposed to be rigid to stop the foot from moving. It's kind of control the rear foot. That doesn't happen, right? Heel counters have been shown to not make a big difference in terms of foot mobility. Again, take your aim off of foot motion, right? And look at what happens systemically. So what this company did, they actually made these little silicone pads you can see right here, right there on the socks. And these socks are placed in a very strategic point, right? Any shoe you put on, you basically have your sock liner on the inside. There's a void. You can kind of stick your finger right in that little void between the malleoli and the inside of the shoe. There's a void there, right? And their thought process was, hey, if we can put some silicone pads to take up that space, okay, that we can actually provide a sensory contact between the sock liner on the inside of the shoe and the actual skin of the user. And they thought that would actually result in improved control. Many times in my career, I've been wrong. I thought this is a ridiculous study, but they want to do it and said, okay, let's go ahead and give it a whirl. So guess what? We actually did a study for them, looked at about 30 different individuals, and we saw improvements in full body ground reaction force oscillation, right? So this is basically looking at how much wobble the entire center of mass is deviating in the frontal plane, and also something called dynamic postural stability index, which looks at how rapidly you stabilize yourself on a landing task. And we saw more of an improvement using these little proprioceptive type cues inside the socks than we did with any midsole revision from any company in that 5-year period, right? So the idea is the upper should move with the foot, right? That shoe is a sensory sort of phenomena on top of your foot, on the side of your foot, around your foot, right? And so when you look at what's happening with uppers and smart fabrics, we always talk about cushioning, compliance, and stability and all this. Yes, those all important, but the upper does matter actually a lot in terms of comfort, fit, and shape. So an upper that moves with the foot is really, really beneficial. Let's progress that down the line. We did a study we published with BOA looking at different upper configurations, right, several years ago. And connection to the midsole actually matters. We saw actually pretty significant changes in terms of agility measures, endurance measures, agility measures, and also power measures just by changing how the upper wrapped the foot. So again, your take home here is connecting the foot to the midsole matters, right? So when you tell people, does the shoe feel comfortable? It's nice to say that in terms of a kind of lay language, but what you're looking for is, does the shape of the shoe actually match the shape of your foot? And does the upper wrap nicely around your foot? I found it interesting over my career that, the foot is a very asymmetric machine, and yet most shoe companies out there have us running in what we call symmetric, U-throat cuts where there's the upper looks nothing like a foot, right? So this idea, I hope we see a lot of advancement in upper design and mating the upper with the midsole materials to make sure we have something that wraps systemically to give us a good input into our foot to get better output in terms of control and proprioception. Drop. So this is the thing which has gotten probably the most kind of attention since Born to Run came out and we started talking about barefoot running, and the idea that, typically feet are flat, right? Where our typical barefoot is flat on the ground, and that most shoes have, over the past several decades, have been in what we call a 2-to-1 drop, where the rear foot's twice as high as the forefoot. It's important to understand that that changing this alignment between the rear foot and the forefoot change proprioception. It definitely changes loading patterns, right, away from a more equal pattern, more towards a quad dominant firing pattern. I mean, think about this. If you're doing squats these days, if you want to bias your quads, what do? You elevate your heels to put more load in your quads, right? So elevating your heels actually transfers more loads to knee. And we talk about Achilles. People think, oh, well, if you raise it, you're changing Achilles loads. And some studies show you do, some studies show you don't. I would never take a runner who's having active Achilles irritation and drop them, because remember, strain is length under load, and if you drop the rear foot, you're actually elongating the strain amount of the Achilles during every stride. So I'd never take someone who's got an irritable Achilles and actually drop them during that time. I wait to a time when things were calmed down. But just putting out there that you do want to think about how it's working with where runners are in that point in time. But what I want to bring to your attention is we always talk about 2-to-1 drop or 0 drop or whatever. It's not that simple, right? So we talk about 2-to-1 drop where the rear foot's twice as high as the forefoot, and 0 drop where the forefoot and rear foot are in the same plane. And this is something easy we can all agree on, but it's not quite that simple. We also have to think about drop and roll, because you can take a rear foot, right, 2-to-1 drop, and have a certain amount of toe spring or toe rocker, and you can have the same 2-to-1 drop and have a greater amount of toe rocker, right? You can even convex the entire outsole, as some shoe companies are doing these days. Likewise, you can take a 0 drop shoe and you can make a 0 drop shoe with a very minimal to no or even to flat forefoot rocker, or you can take a 0 drop shoe and basically put a lot of toe rocker on it. Those of you who've been around for a while remember when a few companies came out with 0 drop shoes originally, and they actually had some shoes that came out with a lot of toe spring. And it's funny because the 0 drop shoes with a lot of toe spring tended to what? They rolled, okay, pretty easily, right? Whereas zero drop shoes with no toe spring didn't roll as easily. And so the zero drop shoes without a toe spring felt pretty traditional to most people. And the ones that were flatter felt like you had to kind of work to get over something. And so we're talking about is drop at the rear foot and toe spring at the forefoot affects how we roll over the ankle and how we roll over our met heads as a package, okay? And that's really, really important to think about how this works in conjunction with the ankle mobility your patient presents with and also their forefoot mobility, right? If you've got a patient with hallux rigidus, you probably need something that's going to have a lot of toe spring to help them roll over their met heads because their foot is stiffer in their met heads, right? So thinking about how, again, their unique needs impact what you're going to put on their body. And it's not just drop and roll. We also talk about twist, right? So one of the funny things for me is, one of the companies came to me years ago and said, why don't you test this new shoe? And what's different? Like, okay, well, we change the flex groove patterns. And I was like, that's ridiculous. But how the shoe twists, right, makes a big difference in how the shoe actually segments. And when the shoe segments or distorts, right, and twists with the foot, we get good sensory feedback. So it's really as important how that shoe can have roll, right, in terms of the sagittal plane, and how it twists in terms of that transverse plane to make sure it contacts the foot. So I would say that most runners, okay, tend to do well in 0 to 8 mil drop shoes. A few things here, right? Lower drop shoes are going to change a few things, right? Lower drop shoes are going to put the gastrocsoleus and Achilles in a longer position. That might be a time to do something you want to think about for your patient. It might not be. It might be actually contraindicated what they have going on from an injury standpoint at that point in time. Moderate amounts of drop allow more midsole material underfoot because if you have zero drop, you have less stack height, right, under the heel. And most people, about 82 to 80%, 88% of runners will contact on the rear foot, right? So if you want more material down there, a little bit of drop, it can be helpful. Higher drops allow for the most displacement underfoot. So again, just allowing that cushioning to compress and rebound, right? So, but don't forget about what happens to the knee. Remember we said if you're going to angulate up in terms of drop, you're going to shift a little more loads to the knee. It's just mechanics. I can make an argument to get a lot of runners into a lower drop shoe. But again, if you've got people who are symptomatic, that doesn't mean it's a good time to transfer people over. Zero drop is not the endpoint for all runners. So many runners out there these days think I'm not a quote real runner unless I can get in a zero drop shoe. Again, zero drop is baseline. We can talk about that. But again, you'd want to increase that drop to rear foot if you want more cushioning. You want to increase that drop if you've got a restriction in an ankle or forefoot mobility, right? So again, thinking about how the system works together. But zero drop is not what you're looking at for everyone. And some people it works great. Some people it doesn't. Some people prefer 0 to 3 to 4. But to say I have to get everybody into a traditional drop, which is 12 millimeters higher rear foot than forefoot, can't really make that argument that we need to actually rock our people up that far. And we talked about hallux rigidus already, but just the idea that thinking about how toe spring in the shoe, convexity of the midsole, drop, etc., all work together, and you're having a reason to change something if you're going to have a reason to change, and give them time to acclimate because you are putting tissues in different elongation amounts and rates when you change the geometry of the shoe itself. Let's talk about cushioning. So every study out there, right? If you just let's take a step back for a second. If I ask you to tie your shoes with your bare hands, it's pretty simple, right? If I ask you to tie your shoes with gloves on, it's a little bit harder. It's not because your hands got weaker. It's because you can't feel what you're actually doing, right? And that's the same thing with the midsole, right? If you put your foot on the ground, you are restricting or eliminating sensory feedback to your body. And the problem is that more cushion, right, actually impairs proprioception. It hurts our ability to figure out where we are in space. More cushioning actually causes our runners to land stiffer. It's interesting. More cushioning, softer shoes, we land stiffer because we lose that proprioceptive feedback. Okay. And, cushioning isn't just for impact reduction. These changes aren't just at contact, right? They're throughout the whole stance phase, right? So we're saying it's not just at that point where your heel hits the ground. It's the entire stance phase. You're lacking proprioceptive input and a little bit more stiff throughout that whole stance phase. So it's not just for impact reduction. It's how we use feedback throughout the whole gait cycle. So Again, I always go back to those of you who are looking at using training devices in your clinic, which is pretty much everyone, right? Think about how can we put the foot in a better environment. We know that if we put the foot on wobbly, unstable, cushioned surfaces, we are impairing sensory feedback, okay? You're delaying sensory feedback to our brain, which directly impairs proprioception. When we don't have proprioception is a sensory phenomenon. When I don't have good proprioception in, I can't make good efferent decisions, right? Good motor control decisions on how to stabilize my foot and ankle. Contrast that to hard surfaces, right, which can be firm on the ground or wobbly unstable, right, like rocker boards and wobble boards, right? Hard surfaces give us uniform feedback, right? So if we're trying to upregulate proprioceptive input, we want to give good sensory feedback. Too much cushion impairs sensory feedback. So same arguments hold true in terms of proprioceptive training. Same arguments hold true in terms of how you treat a vestibular patient, right? Same arguments hold true in terms of footwear. More cushioning is actually going to create a reduced sensory feedback and actually make our runners oftentimes more unstable. So let's talk about stability. There's a study we did for a company years ago, and this follows that classic argument, right? I mean, drove me nuts. I got an email just a few weeks ago from my one of my kids' cross-country coaches and track coaches and saying, okay, look, if you're looking for shoes, you want to get a shoe, you take it, you shouldn't be able to twist it back and forth. That means it's a strong, stable shoe. We're still having this conversation. It drives me crazy. This is what they do at, the hiking boot store, right? You walk into REI and the guy says, oh, take the shoe, and if you can take this boot, you can twist it real easy. It's garbage, and we want shoes that are nice and stiff. My counter argument to that is we know the foot doesn't land flat, right? The foot needs to torsion and roll down to the ground. So if you're putting people on super stiff shoes, guess what? You're having them land on a lever, okay? We took 5 boots from this company and actually had people do what's called Dynamic Postural Stability Index test. You stand on 2 feet, you jump over a box, and you land on a force plate. And we measure the amount of force vertically, front to back, side to side, right? And we also measure how quickly you control those forces and basically get back to a quiet single leg stance. And so we looked at boots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's all variations of some different boots. And we found that all of them kind of tested in that same realm. And then we said, okay, let's have this prototype boot. And prototype boot was very torsionally flexible. And we saw a statistically significant improvement in terms of the DPSI test, how the athletes stabilized themselves, right? Not the shoe. They had less wobble, less instability, and a faster time to stability in the more torsionally mobile shoe. And just for kicks, we threw an extra minimal shoe in there. So it was 0 drop, 0 cushion shoe, and that performed even better, right? So again, when you put less junk between you and the ground, you stabilize better, right? Pretty simple. So the way I explain this to patients a lot of time, if you're going to go sit in traffic to go drive somewhere, right, with the beach, you got the dog, the kids, you got a bunch of pool stuff in there, you're going to the beach, okay, it's okay if you want to be comfortable, because when you're walking around, when you're sitting in traffic, right, you're not doing a whole lot, okay? And so you can put a lot of stuff in there and be comfortable. If you want to cushion your shoe, fine. You're not going to hurt my feelings. You're not going to hurt anything else. But if I said, hey, we're going to go have you pick a car to drive Highway 1 as fast as possible, you're probably not going to pick a big SUV. You probably want to pick a sports car. Why? They're firmer, stiffer, lower slung, close to the ground, better ground feel, right? When you feel what's happening through the steering wheel, you know the limits of the car. Guess what? If your body can feel more what's happening underfoot, right, you have better feeling, better sensation. We tend to make better decisions. So we talk about running health, right? Footwear does make a difference in how we get sensory feedback to the ground to stabilize our body. Remember, it's not the shoe, it's what the user does in the shoe, which is important. So let's talk about our midsole and posting, right? So remember, we said at contact, okay, you've got a very tiny stability challenge. Why? Because right at contact, your center of mass is still up in the air, and your foot and your leg, right, it's called a leg spring mass, you're just basically throwing it in front of you, and it's contacting the ground, okay? So what happens is, at that point of contact, right, there's not a whole lot of challenge to your entire body. Up at mid stance, right, this is when we've got our peak stability challenge. This is when I have to control myself in terms of front to back, side to side, rotation, right? That's my peak stability challenge. And so what I would say is, a colleague of mine running a company said, if we're still selling shoes with a medial post in it in 5 years, please hit me in the head with an anvil. And they know that posting doesn't, quote, control motion, okay? And again, we mentioned before, the foot's most deformed, most in need of some help after the heel comes off the ground, okay? So we know that at the point in time where that post is connected between the medial aspect of the rear foot and the ground, it's not even on the ground to touch anything, okay? So number one, there's no impetus for it to act. And number two, posting may actually cause some harm. And let's talk about why. So on the left side of the screen, we'll see a graphic from a publication we did back in 2008. So here is the ground reaction force coming up. And the ground reaction force during stance comes up lateral to the ankle, comes up medial to the knee, and it comes up medial to the hip. Now, you've got the active ability to control loads in terms of inversion and eversion of the foot and ankle. Why? Because that foot and ankle can articulate voluntarily in that plane. Likewise in the hip, right? We've got muscles and a nervous system that controls our hip that allows us to control motion between the pelvis and the hip, right? So we can come up and control those forces and control those frontal plane loads. Problem is, we don't have the ability to actively adduct or abduct the knee, right? We can't do that. And so when you've got these forces kind of medial to the knee, what they're doing is they're trying to compress and shear the inside of the knee, okay? Now, when you look at what posting does, posting actually gives the foot sensory feedback, and since we have that sensory feedback, we see the center of pressure shift medial. And what happens is, when the center of pressure goes medial, we tend to see the ground reaction force migrate more medial, which causes an increase in the frontal plane or the coronal plane knee moment torque, okay? And so when we do this, what happens is we're putting more compressive and shear load on the inside of the knee. It's interesting that the highest incidence of osteoarthritis in shod societies is in the medial compartment of the knee. Interestingly enough, the highest incidence of osteoarthritis in non-shod societies is up at the hip, and actually occurs about 8 to 10 years later in terms of progression. So posting and traditionally cushioned footwear isn't just changing where things occur, they also accelerate this change. Now, to be realistic, right? Let's balance this off and give a counter argument here. If you've got somebody with lateral compartment OA, what might you want to do? Well, you probably want to put a medial rear foot post, right? To pull things over, to shift it around. So think about how this works in terms of proprioceptive and mechanical, migration in terms of forces. We'll talk a little bit more about this in orthotics just a little bit later in this talk, but just understanding what posting does. Medial posting shifts the center of pressure medial, which will actually shift ground action force medial and increases shear forces at the knee. Geez. What happened in maximal cushion footwear? We had the minimal revolution kind of take the world by storm. Then we swung. The pendulum loves to swing, right? The pendulum went all the way over to the other side in maximal cushion shoes. And so there's been some variability here, right? So some of my colleagues here at OSU have actually looked at this as well, looking at differences in mechanics in maximally cushioned shoes as compared to traditional, and also what happens during that transitional process. I would say that most of the time we tend to see some changes in gait, right? All that wobbly, unstable foam, and these shoes also tend to have a lot of rocker underneath the forefoot, underneath the midfoot, because it's so much shoe, it's hard to bend, right? So typically they have a convex orientation to them, and we run differently, right? So I would say for the most part, people tend to change the way they land in terms of stiffness. They need to definitely adapt to these shoes. In my lab, I've seen most folks will typically have a lot more instability in terms of frontal plane ground action force oscillations. So not just the foot, but the whole body tends to move a little bit more. I've actually seen lower loading rates in some of the studies we've done using an instrumented treadmill for a steady state speed. Some of my colleagues' labs have looked at loading rates in terms of maximal shoes and actually seen lower loading rates, but they're using an overground study. So a little different testing arrangement here, but I'd say that we definitely run different in maximal cushion shoe. Super shoes, the hot topic of the day everybody loves to talk about. Let's take a step back for a second, not talk about shoes. Let's talk about cushioning versus compliance. When you talk about cushion, you're talking about something underfoot which is going to compress and rebound, right? And that's pretty much what we summarized in this talk so far. We're talking about cushion materials designed to compress and rebound. Compliance surfaces are very different, right? Compliance surfaces, when you basically load them, they will actually bounce back up again. So you can imagine If you took, let's say, two pieces of wood, right, and you basically slung a piece of plywood between them, right? So as you compress, you can imagine if I just have this little sticky note here, right? If I'm supporting it, and if I anchor the outsides, if I compress the inside, that will rebound. Compress and rebound, compress and rebound. This is not cushioning with soft tissue under here. This is actually what? A plate, okay? In this first case I'm going to talk about, it was a track, okay? So Dr. Tom McMahon designed a track at Harvard, which was designed to be springy. It was designed to be a tuned surface that would distort and rebound, okay, alongside a certain time and amount of compression, right? This amount of distortion and rebound was tuned to be in line with elite collegiate runners, right? Which have a pretty narrow weight range and a pretty cohesive mechanics in terms of ground contact time, because they're all running pretty similar speeds. And what they did was they designed a special track and said, hey, can we design a faster surface? And on the very first day this track was used in a meet back in 1987, 2 collegiate and 8 meet records were established, and that meet alone, 35 competitors qualified for NCAA championships. So can we produce an environment which actually optimizes the what? Stiffness of the center of mass, which changes the amount of elasticity given back to the runner? Yes, we can. You basically put runners on a trampoline-based track, okay? And so the idea here is you were able to optimize elasticity of the system. This is the same thing as your kids running around in moon boots, right? It's not cushion. You're allowing them to have little mini trampolines underfoot. And guess what? That's what we're doing with super shoes, okay? Carbon plates with novel foams allow us to change and optimize stiffness of the system, which improves elasticity. This is really easy to do when you say, hey, I want to design a shoe to put runners in a certain mass range with a certain time on ground with a certain amount of muscle stiffness, right, to basically optimize that stiffness and actually improve the performance. And do they work? Yes, they do. No surprise here. We see lots of shoes come out in that 4% range, 3% range, 5% range. People are striving towards that 8% range, right? Can we allow that system of what? Foam, plate, foam with foot on top to compress and rebound. We basically made the decision that we're comfortable with allowing people to shoe dope, okay? And so what happens here is you're allowing people to have a trampoline underfoot, and you're allowing people to also, by stiffening up this underfoot orientation, you're also shifting center pressure forward, which allows you to what? Improve the hip vector for hip power. So you're changing a lot of things. The problem I want you to realize is, think about a trampoline. If you jump on ground, you'll have a certain height per jump. It's no secret that if you jump on a trampoline, you jump higher. Why? Because the trampoline distorts and rebounds with you, okay? But if you jump on that trampoline up and down, okay, and you come down straight up and down, most of that energy goes up and down. But you know that if you come up a little bit to the side, a little bit forward, a little back, guess what? The trampoline doesn't discriminate. It will rebound you in the direction you came in. So if you come in unstable, guess what? These shoes will magnify your instability. I will tell you on a incidental note, I have had some of my own athletes miss very critical races like the Olympics because they came in getting super shoes and weren't acclimated to them and had things kind of spiral downhill pretty quickly. So be careful with this in terms of, again, getting people to acclimate, and also be careful in terms of tuning. Remember, these shoes are designed for lighter weight, really efficient runners with short ground contact times and with a certain body mass, right? So you're basically designing a trampoline to optimize compression and rebound, right, in terms of a very narrow group. If you take somebody who's 50 pounds heavier than that narrow range, which is a different stride mechanics, they're not going to work as effectively. And let's kind of go through this a little bit. Are super shoes faster than traditional shoes and spikes? Yes, they are. They improve running economy. I cycled one study here, but again, there's multiple studies which have shown that they actually do. Now, if you're not an elite runner, will they actually help you? Yes, they will, but they're much smaller in magnitude, right? So instead of seeing those 4 to 5% changes, we're looking at 0.8 to about 1.2 to 2.4% changes. So is that worth $400 to you? That's the decision you have to make with your pocketbook. Okay. Do the shoes help with uphill and downhill as well as flat? Yes, but slightly less. Here's one study from Whiting just came out looking at, again, an average improvement in terms of one of these super shoes tested was 3.83% in terms of metabolic economy. The uphill was 2.8 and the downhill was 2.7. So less than flat, but still a performance advantage there for sure. This is the thought. This is the one that I want to get into our wheelhouse, though, because most people aren't coming to see us because they want to run faster. Most people are coming to see us because they're hurt. And when you say, do super shoes affect biomechanics? Yes, they do. All of the work that we collectively have done in terms of gait cueing has shown that we want to try and do some things to what? Increase cadence, change contact time, right? Like make that pendulum swing close to the center of mass so we can change and reduce the moments, especially the knee moment, right? To optimize our mechanics. These super shoes are shifting things in the other direction. Okay, so we are seeing decreased cadence, longer flight times, higher ground action forces, and changes in the ankle. We're seeing decreased ankle joint dorsiflexion in terms of kinematics and changes in peak ankle moments. More energy is being stored in the midsole and less in the tendons themselves and the ankle, right? You're basically giving people a trampoline. No wonder they're actually running faster, right? And again, we're seeing changes in terms of ankle kinematics and also ankle plantar flexion velocities, right? So, sorry, there's a little misspelling there. But do these changes we see cause injury? Factually, we can't say they do, right? There's no studies out there yet, but I would say that, again, we're talking about all the gait cueing work we've done for the past, let's say, almost decade has been shifting towards one direction. These super shoes are shifting things in the opposite direction. So be careful. Allow your athletes to have time to adapt to these shoes. I know they're trendy right now. I know they're popular. Just be cohesive in your thinking and making sure you're thinking about, does this make sense for you where you are right now? Not to mention the equity side here. These are expensive. It's a shame when you've got people showing up at a start line that can't afford this shoe, right? So it's something else to think about as well. In terms of shoe weight, right? Lightweight is better than no weight. When you think about people say, okay, I want to run barefoot because barefoot has no shoe weight, right? And so therefore it should be most optimal. This is one of my colleagues I work with, Jason Franz, who looked at the cost of running in a barefoot condition and barefoot with little lead strips applied to the foot to simulate the weight of a shoe, but not allow cushioning right underfoot because they were barefoot, but they had the weight of the shoe on them, and then actually running in a lightweight shoe themselves. And what we found was that, what Franz and his colleagues found was that, shoe weight does matter, right? So for every 100 grams you take off, you can actually change energy expenditure just by changing shoe mass, okay? Running barefoot actually is expensive, right? It actually does cost some energy to run barefoot, but you've got lightweight, right? So that's why I don't differ in terms of energy cost. But when you use those lead strips, again, run barefoot, but put the weight of a shoe on the foot, you actually tend to see that lightweight shoes have 3 to 4% less energy expenditure than running barefoot. And the reason why, again, you have to use some metabolic effort in your terms of your foot to control those damping forces, control mid-stance, and control push-off. Whereas having a shoe lets you have some geometry to let that foot roll, and also a little bit of cushion and compliance during the loading process. Another study the same group did, Roger Cram's lab, was looking at taking a woodway type treadmill, right, where you have decks, little strips on the deck itself versus a belt, right, and actually putting different amount of cushioning on the slats themselves. So they had these people run with a flat slat, okay, no cushioning, having run with slats at 10 millimeters of cushioning and 20 millimeters of cushioning. And what they found was a little bit of cushioning went a long way in terms of giving you decreased energy expenditure. Actually about 1.91% improvement in metabolic power with a little bit of cushioning. Doubling the thickness to what we see in maximal shoes didn't actually benefit in terms of energy expenditure. So to say that more cushioning in terms of traditional shoes, not super shoes with plates, right? We're not playing trampoline games. We're just talking about conventional EVA foams, didn't improve economy. So again, a little cushioning goes a long way in terms of performance, and more cushioning isn't necessarily better. Again, super shoes are using a tuned environment, right, of taking our foot, then foam, then plate, then foam, then rubber, right? You're creating a trampoline here. right? This is very different than traditional cushion-based footwear. Going towards midsole wear, I love this study. This was done a long time ago, but the old kind of lore was you should have two shoes, and you run in one shoe one day, you run the next shoe the other day, so that shoe can kind of rest and recover and rebound. Shoes don't have feelings, okay? They're not people. So when you run in a shoe, you have a certain amount of structure with the EVA itself. So they took shoes, and they basically took shoes brand new, shoes at 500 kilometers and shoes at 750 kilometers, and took those shoes, cut them in half, dipped them in 24 karat gold, and then basically put them under electron micrographs. They can actually visualize the pore structure of the EVA, ethyl vinyl acetate, in the midsole. And what they found was in the midsole, brand new shoe, you can see how we have very intact pores, right? The structuring of the cushion integrity is there, right? When you run on a pair of shoes, they break down. No secret, right? And you can look, there's some kind of fraying around the edges of these pores at 500 kilometers. And we look at C, right? So we've actually started to break through the structure itself. So we've got some of the structure is not cohesive anymore. So the cushioning properties of this shoe at a worn environment are definitely very different mechanically than the cushion properties of a brand new pair of shoes. So do shoes break down with use? Yes, here's definitive proof they do break down. Again, your shoe isn't a biomechanically active system, right? It's not going to repair itself. So they break down and break down and break down. And how do we adjust this as people? Well, we change the way we move, right? We're pretty lazy. And what we find is the research shows that we tend to change our kinematics to keep the external loads consistent. What I'm saying is we subtly shift the amount of motion at our hip, knee, ankle, right, to try and maintain my same energy expenditure and maintain those external loads. And so if they shift me that preferred movement a little bit too far, they may result in injury. I think that any single person out there who's run and said, hey, I can consistently get this many miles in a pair of shoes, and then after a certain point I start to become a little achy, I got the same shoe brand new and it felt fine. And that's why. So they shift our preferred movement strategy just enough. And again, that may be saying, hey, look, I'm moving, a certain amount of degrees from, origin to peak, right, back and forth. And then when these shoes break down, they shift my preferred movement pattern just enough to the point where I start to change my gait, and then things become a little bit overstressed, right? So that's how we change that shoe wear. We change our range of motion to keep our external output in a certain window. Shoes don't wear uniformly, though. We think that as they wear, we tend to kind of just break down and down and down and down. The reality is footwear tends to be anchored where? On the outside, right? They're anchored on the outside of the last, between the medial side on the first ray and the lateral side on the fifth ray, right? And then all the way back to the rear foot. And so the idea here is that, if you thought about shoes wearing consistently, meaning they're just packing down, packing down, packing down, packing down, we have a nice, stable uniform contact for the foot. The reality is that's not what happens, right? The outside stay anchored, and what happens is we actually tend to fold, right? So the second and third and fourth med heads tend to sit lower than the first and the fifth over time. And that changes the orientation position of the med heads, which change what? Proprioceptive information to the foot. So, if you think about somebody comes in with, some changes in terms of foot mobility, you do a bunch of manual work with them or try to do some gait retraining or whatever, and you put them back in that environment that's been broken down for a long time, that might not be the best way for them to transfer their new neuromuscular work you're doing with them in the clinic in their footwear. So take some time, look at how a worn shoe is broken down, and see if they need to get something, again, to put them in a new baseline when you're getting them back running again. Energy return. Despite claims, no manufacturer has ever successfully achieved energy return in footwear testing. And I want to make this clear. You would literally need an engine to power or push a center of mass back up in terms of conventional type footwear. To double back what I said before about super shoes, what you're doing is you're allowing the center of mass to actually have some true excursion up and down. And there was a great master's thesis written years ago I found, which basically looked at the idea. This is from Tom McMahon's lab in Harvard, which basically showed that if you could allow the center of mass to actually displace about 9 millimeters, that you actually could see some energy return effect. So it's possible that these trampoline shoes we're in, right, the super shoes, are allowing that to occur. But in terms of conventional shoes, you're not returning energy to the runner, right? You're not actually giving that back. You are having loss. You're having less loss, if that makes sense. Okay. So energy return, no, but foam more, yes. I mean, I think we've also seen a huge change, not just super shoes. We've seen things shift from EVA-based foams to polyurethane-based foams, and they're different cushioning environments, right? It's plain and simple. They have a different feel to them. The one thing I will say is, early on, it's funny when PU foams first came out, we had companies using a certain amount of traditional EVA foam in certain geometries, and they said, okay, let's try PU, and they stuck these pretty dense materials underfoot, and shoes felt horrible for a while. And they've learned that it doesn't take as much polyurethane-based foam to get the same damping qualities as we see with EVA-based foam. So that's why I've seen a lot of evolution in terms of the amount, location of these foams over time, and even blending those foams to get better results. So, the idea here is the magic midsole, right? A magic midsole would be something that can produce a lot of proprioceptive aid, right? To improve the way the runner senses the ground and get them stabilizing during the stance phase. That's what we want. Cofactors here are mass, speed, contact style, muscle morphology, and running form. These are all variable aspects, right? So it's why everyone's not the same in terms of how much they weigh, how fast they're running, the way they contact, right? So you may find that, hey, based upon this runner's needs, they need this type of shoe, okay? But I hope we've given some evidence here to change the way we talk about footwear. When I went to school and back in 2000, right, we learned words like shoes need to be rigid. They need to hold or lock the foot in place, and shoes stabilize the foot. We've not seen that play out. We've not seen conclusive evidence that footwear actually stops the foot from moving, changes foot mechanics, right? We said feet are variable and they move slightly different. That's fine, right? Let the foot move the way it's supposed to. But I want to try and use terms like adapt, conform, match, and support the foot in moving the way it's going to move, right? So we're trying to interface with a foot, which is an adaptive lever, and we need to allow the foot to move, to twist, to torsion, and maintain that torsion mobility in the foot is really, really, really important. Let's put this all together. I talked to my patients that shoes are pretty much like an Oreo, right? Up top, we want to have a well-footing last. If you take that insole out, put it in the ground, you should see that when you place your foot on top of the insole, you should see that we have room for the forefoot to splay. Your forefoot should not be overhanging. If that's the case, that shoe is not fitting your body, right? When you make sure we have a shoe that fits the foot, not the other way around, cramming the foot in. In terms of cushioning, right? A little bit of cushioning goes a long way in terms of improving economy, right? So we said earlier, 10 millimeters of cushioning was not less good than 20 millimeters. More cushioning wasn't better. More cushioning actually impaired more proprioception, right? So enough gives us good compliance during to offset some load and to get some benefit. In terms of geometry underfoot, right, we want to have good roll, right, from the rear foot and also the toe rocker, and it's really important to have that torsional flex, right? And think about the heel radius. A wide block heel radius puts the center of pressure, right, way outside the foot, which can actually increase pronation velocity, right? We said pronation amount has never been correlated with injury, but pronation velocity actually has. So it always puzzles me when shoes get wider in the rear foot, you're actually increasing the lever arm of the rear foot, increasing pronation velocity. So thinking about how all those play together is a really important thing to think about what that Oreo is doing under your foot. And again, if somebody is symptomatic and you say, hey, I want to change your shoes, be cautious on what you're putting underfoot, right? So if they come in with a raging case of plantar fascia tendinopathy, right, plantar fascia irritation, and you know that as that foot dorsiflexes and as the medheads dorsiflex, you're putting more tension with the windlass mechanism underfoot, and you may say, hey, there's a reason to put somebody in a more maximally cushioned rockered shoe, right, temporarily to offset the mechanical strain and deformation of the plantar fascia. That makes sense. It's not a bad judgment at all. And no wonder a lot of people have success with rockered cushioned shoes with plantar fascia problems. But long term, what are you doing? We know maximally cushioned shoes tend to have that convexity to them, right? And we have less motion occurring through the ankle. We're having less motion occur through the medheads, and you're minimizing that contact. And while you may minimize some motion demand at the foot and ankle, that shifts a bunch of things in terms of movement mechanics and economy upstream, right? Not to mention the fact that long term, it's not the best environment to rebuild a solid, stable foot in. So while they may have a short term benefit, it's kind of a crutch, right? Long term, think about, is that really the best environment to be in, right? So again, thinking about your patient is really more important than trying to match what their training partner's in. few other things here, right? I want to cover orthotics, and this is kind of following the same sort of aspect here. My colleague Eric Magro and I wrote an article in Sports Medicine Review years ago, and we'll kind of summarize a lot of that for you now to kind of put this all in one place. When we look at feet, we think about a bell curve, right? We mentioned before that feet move more similar than different in that bell curve. Yes, we can have super hypermobile and super hypermobile feet. That we definitely see those, but for the most part, people move more similar than different. How much does it take to actually unload tissue? If you're talking about posting, because people love to talk about postness to unload, we'll show you some metrics here on that. Core orthotics actually cause a downside, right? How does proprioception variability relate to orthotics use? And then some personal practice on short-term versus fixing the underlying problem here. So remember we said feet move more similarly than different, right? So in terms of, am I trying to stop range of motion, control things? Not so much. You want the foot to move as it's supposed to. And if you've got somebody who's a zebra in a field of horses, that might take things outside this argument a little bit. But for the most part, we're not trying to stop the foot from moving. We're trying to move with the foot. And most importantly, we're trying to eventually train the person to control all the range of motion they've got. So if you have somebody come in with hypermobile structure, train them to own all the range of motion in their hypermobile structure. Pretty simple, right? Number two, we did some research for a company years ago looking at the effect of posting on unloading the posterior tibialis, right? And if you think about posting, people post in terms of 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees is a lot of posting. We actually looked at, in our lab, we actually had runners in different amounts of posting from 0 to 30 degrees of posting. And we didn't see an unloading in terms of the ankle eversion moment, okay, which is what you'd see if you're gonna see an unloading of the posterior tib. You see a change in the ankle eversion moment during stance. We didn't see it at 0, we didn't see it at 5 degrees, didn't see it at 10, didn't see it at 20. We had to get to 25 degrees, which is a lot of posting, before we're able to see a quantifiable change in the amount of rear foot demand, right? That rear foot torsional demand that was asked in the posterior tib to do its job. So when you think about posting, if you're going to say, I'm actually going to mechanically unload the posterior tib, takes 25 degrees, okay, to get a change. So imagine driving your car on a flat road versus a banked road, right? The banked road allows you to push in and truly unload it. Now, I'm sure people watching this have said, hey, I've gotten results with people with 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of posting. I'm not saying you can't. What you're seeing, though, is a proprioceptive change, okay? The runner is changing their gait, changing their mechanics in response to that cue you're giving underfoot. But mechanically, it's not enough to actually unload the posterior tib at that amount. Okay, so just understand the difference between proprioceptive change, which is very powerful, and mechanical change, which is truly a quantified decrease in tissue load. Again, talk about posting again, right? So we said posting affects things not just in the foot, but also upstream, right? So we know that if you put that post underfoot, right, you're going to have an increase in the knee moment, right? So talking about this again, those highly inverted orthotics we just mentioned, right? They actually had a 20% increase in knee varus torque. So what is your patient coming in with, right? If they've got an acute flared up posterior tibialis issue, right? I'm not saying putting in aggressive rear foot posting is bad, because you will quantifiably change the load going through that posterior tib in a good way. But you're really overloading the knee. 27% change is a huge increase, right? Is enough to cause knee OA? We don't know, right? But certainly shifting things in the wrong direction, okay? And then likewise, remember, using our critical thinking hat, right? A valgus wedge will reduce knee varus torque by 6 to 7%, right? So if you've got somebody coming in with OA at the knee, where are their issues, and can we use wedging and posting to kind of change these things? Of course we can, right? And sometimes even a little something can make things go wrong, right? This is a study we published years ago looking at the influence of just an over-the-counter arch support, right? This is just at the time it was like $10 over-the-counter arch support, and all it did was just have a little arch cookie underfoot. And what that does, when you put more arch support underfoot, guess what it does? Shifts that center of pressure immediately, and does what? Increases the knee varus torque, right? So even just a simple thing like an arch support can shift things in a certain direction. Most people, it's going to be the wrong direction, because most people have a higher incidence of OA at the medial compartment of the knee. But understanding what that arch support does, arch supports aren't always the answer. In fact, most of the time they're the enemy. I know people are used to it, right? We're stuck with this lore at the running industry that we want to wrap the foot and have a nice tight fit snug, that's not what we're looking at, right? We have to allow the foot to move, and when we limit the foot from moving or try and shove the things up in the foot, it responds by doing weird stuff, right? So allow the foot to move as it should. Here's a great study in terms of some over-the-counter orthotics by Reed Ferber several years ago. And I love the study because it didn't just look at amounts, right? Because, again, we said there's no real gold standard in terms of amount of foot motion. But what it looked at was variability. Okay, so when you put certain things underfoot, right, they looked at the sole, insoles, super feet, and power step, right? They actually saw some improvements, not in range of motion, but a significant effect on tissue strain, which is modeled as variability, right? So for most people, giving something that matched the shape of their foot, right? So a lot of these insoles come in kind of high arch, low arch, middle of the road arch, right? So if you put somebody's foot on something that feels comfortable, right? It just matches the shape and curvature of their foot, right? Not a support trying to push up, but it's matching the shape of their foot. They saw a decrease variability in terms of running mechanics, right? And that might have an effect on tissue loading. So thinking about how this goes back to your net effect. Right. I love and have had a lot of success with thousands of patients using toe spacers, right? So, we always talk about, shoes matter, right? But can we do something to cue the foot to work better? Well, if you put the foot in a wider position, right, you're basically encouraging and biasing them to use that toe splay, and you're getting a more stable environment. And we've actually seen that when you put toe spacers in, what you're doing is you're helping the patient use all the strength and ability they have at that given time. Do they actually strengthen the feet? No. To strengthen the feet, you have to apply what? Tissue overload to actually improve strength, right? And you might get some of that minimally if you're going from a very, let's say a weak, unconditioned foot to using a toe space. You might see some change at that point in time. Initially in that rapid progress initially, but more importantly, it's just helping them use the control they have inside their feet by cueing their foot intrinsics to work better. Obviously, you need wide toe boxes for these. For patients who have a hard time fitting them in the shoe, this pinky toe spacer isn't doing a whole lot. And if they don't have a foot-shaped shoe, typically I'll cut off the pinky toe spacer here so they can get these inside their shoes. But I've had a lot of success using these with folks. And yes, during running, okay? Not day one. There has to be some callus buildup, but I'll have them walk in these shoes for a considerable point of time and then get them into running. And it has some great outcomes. Some tips here, right, for hallux valgus, right? So, thinking about what we're trying to do is support the first ray, right? So if the first ray is actually drifting positions, right? So we've got a change in alignment where we're having a hard time. That first ray can't really drive in to control things, right? You might want to play with some rear foot things, some forefoot things, posting the approximately to the first med head, right, to try and give some control there, to try and contact that first metatarsal, because the idea is that if you don't, you're going to have more rotational change, right? So we'll try and show this real quick. Remember, what we think about in terms of a hallux valgus isn't just the fact that the proximal phalanx is shifting inward. What happens is it's the med head that drifts lateral, and then there's ligaments here, right? And therefore, then we tend to see the phalanx drift medial. But, med head drifting medial, then the phalanx drifting lateral. Sorry about that. But the idea here is if you basically do something to base, if you can apply a support just proximal to the ball of the foot under the first met, what happens is you can prevent some of that rotational change from taking place. And when that first met rotates in, right, and plus the frontal plane changes, we tend to see really poor foundation, poor vector for that first ray to exert its push off. So we can talk more about that when we're all together, but there's some options you've got to try and control the rotational alignment of the first met. And functional hallux libitus, right? So we know that if we have a hard time getting dorsiflexion, right, if it's not going to do that, we can give a first ray drop, right, or a cutout to try and allow the base to drop, right, so you can get some effective roll and glide there through the first ray to improve their extension. Likewise, I've had a lot of success using some plates here to expand on the ability for somebody to actually get some roll and glide, to make up for that roll and glide if they can't roll over, right? So you have some options, right? So one thing you can do is you can use a reverse Morton's extension. These plates are here, right? Which are it's a pretty stiff environment underfoot if they can't roll through is you can basically put some of that load onto the graphite insert. That's something you can do. If it's really stiff, you can go to a rocker sole shoe, right? So these maximally cushioned shoes typically have a bunch of roll, right? So if you can't roll properly under the first ray, you can roll with the midsole, right? And then if you've got a super stiff environment where there's a fusion, right? So a lot of times we'll talk about actually putting a full shank under the shoe to actually let that extrinsically roll versus demanding motion that's just not there inside the foot. So some options here to play with things in terms of what am I looking to do, right? Not to say orthotics are good or bad, say what's your rationale for wanting to consider an orthotic and what's it going to do to the actual runner. We're going to go over this test together when we talk about how we look at people who need an orthotic, right, which is an alignment-based issue versus someone you might use some for short term as a soft tissue compensation to unload some things, right? So if you've got an obliquity in terms of your forefoot and rear foot orientation with a really high subtalar joint axis, then I've actually had a lot of success with using orthotics these people because we want to make sure we have the foot in an environment where we can see some torsion of forefoot, rear foot. And if they have an excessively high subtalar neutral position, what happens is you're going to force a lot of torsion through the knee and the hip, and that's not what we're seeking, right? So we're going to use this test, which we'll go over together to help differentiate where people are and who needs an orthotic biomechanically versus somebody doesn't need one. You're not saying you can't use one short term, but they don't need that underfoot long term. So just like we talked about for footwear, right? So I hope we're giving some credence here. The idea behind orthotics is not using terms like rigid, lock, hold, and stabilize, and really capitalizing on the ability of the foot to be an adaptive lever, right? Using an orthotic intervention to adapt, conform, match, and support the foot as it moves. Because you're not going to use force to stop the foot from moving. You must feel the force, right? The force will guide us, and the power of proprioception is strong. Thank you so much. Can't wait to see you guys in class.